Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's session. Just a reminder that if you experience any audio or video interruptions, refreshing your browser should take care of any issues. Now, I am very happy to introduce you to Steve, who will be presenting to you on the harsh reality of audit fatigue. Steve, why don't you take it away?
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. This is going to be a hopefully informative session here at the ISACA conference, North America. And so we're going to focus a lot on audit fatigue. And to get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, just to let everybody kind of understand my perspective and where we're coming from an audit or cybersecurity audit perspective. So I joined a company called Telos in roughly 2006. And this was after about an 8-year career at Booz Allen Hamilton doing cybersecurity consulting. A lot of operational security, things like managing a lot of the mail servers, the DNS servers, firewalls, those type of operational security tools. And I got my first taste of really going through hardcore kind of audits at Telos for a lot of our federal government customers. A lot of the U.S. intelligence community, federal civilian agencies, elements of the DoD, and military intel, as well as, consumer organizations or commercial entities in the financial services or healthcare industries. And our product suite was really geared at doing a lot with reducing the complexity of these audits or these reports. So for now, it's been about 15 years focusing on trying to really alleviate this pain. And the concepts have morphed over time. And for the most part, they really do have tendencies that started back 15 or 20 years ago and have led their way through to today. But it's gotten so much worse with volume, with the complexity of everything as far as the different type of audits, the different standards, focus not just on cybersecurity, but also focus on privacy. So we're going to touch on a lot of those things in our discussion here. And I really appreciate everybody's time. So we'll go ahead and get started. What I really want to talk about, in addition to this audit fatigue message, is just not just the burden on the organizations, but the burden on the individuals. So you'll see we commissioned a report, and I'll get into it in a second, by a well-known organization trying to get some real insights into what people were dealing with from a cybersecurity perspective. And some of the responses were shocking, I think, to say the least. And I think if most organizations understood that this is not a problem that they're facing on their own, it's a problem that organizations, throughout different markets and different things are all facing. It's very similar. We could kind of mount a better response to it. And I think ISACA is huge as far as information sharing and having these folks come together and understand that they're not the only ones fighting some of these fights or trying to deal with some of these problems. But we all do seem to get pushed into a corner as far as finding really good cybersecurity staff of folks with great expertise and trying to hold on to them. Maybe no matter how long you've been in a company, it seems like there's a moment where the straw breaks the camel's back as far as dealing with either auditors, internal or external, dealing with the internal security operations teams, because at times, as a compliance or a risk management organization, you're pitted a little bit at odds, cybersecurity operations. We end up losing staff to, because of the high demand, to other organizations or other companies. So this problem really permeates a lot, and we're going to try and touch on a lot of these pieces. And then hopefully give you some good ideas about how to fix some of these problems. How do we get to a place where these burdens are really dramatically reduced, and the speed at which we're able to show and evidence compliance is dramatically reduced as well. And as a result, the time, burden, and energy is also, kind of lessened on the organization and the individuals. So, as I mentioned, we commissioned a study with an independent market research organization, Vance and Bourne. It was conducted roughly around the July-August timeframe of last year, and we had a pretty good turnout for everything. We had a substantial set of responses from IT security professionals all over U.S. organizations. And And it was a real, for us, we kind of knew what we were looking for, but the data told a really compelling story. And that story, we'll kind of unpack here over the course of this next 35, 40 minutes. I want to leave everybody some time for questions. So we'll try and do what we can to make this easy on everybody. So I first heard about audit fatigue. As I mentioned before, 15 years ago, our product was really well known inside of the U.S. federal government space. And a lot of those individuals that have worked in those sectors and within those compliance regimes, if you will, the NIST standards for the most part, really got handpicked to take and lead organizations in the commercial sector. So a lot of the folks that take and run major risk and compliance activities for elements of financial services or healthcare, as I mentioned, different places, different markets, telecommunications, they kind of come from this really heavily regulated federal government space, or at least they've spent time and had stints there. So we were brought in a financial services organization to have a discussion about how we could help with this audit fatigue problem. And it was the first time that I had heard the term audit fatigue. And this was, like I said, it's been a few years now, but it really personifies the pain, right? Because it's not a acute thing. It's something that dulls the senses and dulls the edges over time and really makes things extremely difficult. It's a slow buildup of troublesome problems associated with complying against multiple different standards, right? GDPR from a privacy perspective, the California Privacy Act, the CCPA, or SOC 2, plus if you're in healthcare, anything HIPAA related, and if you're doing anything payment cards, obviously there's PCI DSS, and the PCI DSS are not really that heavy a standard, but there's all kinds of new ones emerging. Kind of, it seems almost quarterly. If you're in financial services, for instance, there's the FFIEC, and now they're kind of consolidating around a new concept of FSSCC, which is the amalgamation of a lot of NIST plus FFIEC and some other standards. So we see these compliance regimes in this methodology of trying to get a handle on risk and compliance activities, and it's burgeoning from the perspective of even recently Virginia, the state of Virginia passed a new privacy regulation, and so organizations are now if you're in the defense industry base, not only do you have to comply with things like SOC 2, and if you have some of these privacy concerns, but now as a member of the defense industry base, you've got to deal with CMMC coming up, or maybe the new DFARS clauses. So when you start rounding out this litany of things that you're responsible for, it begs the question, why? Why is it that we can't kind of have one standard that really makes sense across all of these? Really, organizationally, you could take the stance that we could comply with the high bar and kind of test against the high bar and map against these other sets of regulations. And I think that really is possible. And we'll get into some of the ways in which I think organizations can do that. That's one of the big pieces that I think solves a linchpin problem. But trying to do it, with a small staff and spreadsheets is not tenable. And part of the problem is that none of these standards are obviously written by the same folks. And some of them are derived really, really clearly from things like the NIST standards or the ISO standards, but they're not written so that there's a one-to-one mapping. A lot of times there's a concept of, and so one given set of control that actually is applicable to multiple sets of control from a different regime. It makes it very complex and difficult. And trying to keep track of that in a way that you can kind of evidence the auditors, both internal or external, and be able to showcase this is very, very hard without something really helping. So one of the things we noticed was that organizations are subject to multiple sets of regulations. And this is not even just the heavily regulated organizations like energy or telecommunications or some of the financial services. There's an average number of regulations that we saw from our data set is that there's 13 different regulatory sets of regulatory guidance that an organization has to comply with. And on the average, they usually had somewhere around 22 dedicated staff just to manage compliance from a cybersecurity or privacy perspective. And granted, these are fairly large organizations that I guess you would consider a fair amount of them, like, multinational or, over 1,000 employees, over a certain revenue. But that's still just a very large number. I mean, most of the folks that we talked to immediately started planning for the next audit after the current audit. And it begs the question, where do you have time to start really working on strategy and closing these gaps, that you're finding through these audits? If you're spent literally kind of chasing your tail, going round and round and round. So what's made things, I think, more interesting, I won't say better or worse, but what's made things more interesting lately is that the workforce has gotten more and more distributed. So not just the customers, right, who are now operating from almost any environment. Now you've got a workforce, especially with the last year's pandemic. I'm sure that has come up 100 times today or more in the ISACA conference. Everybody's operating from different places, whether it's, hopefully not the coffee shop with an unprotected wireless connection. But there's technologies that are being employed, a lot more use in VPNs, a lot more use in remote access software that allows for, security on the endpoint device. And so with this distributed workforce and some of the ramifications of that, where data is processed, how it's being operated, really starts to cause havoc, in dealing with this audit and audit response and being able to find the lineage of the data or maybe the sovereignty of where the data is. It all becomes much more complex. With that also has come a really interesting push to the cloud, which I think does create a lot of benefits for most organizations. But again, we start to get into, certain organizations are very good at adopting cloud. They've paid good attention to investing in their folks and their folks understanding, their staff's understanding and training and enrichment, of their capabilities and being able to build, workloads in the cloud and secure those in the cloud. The thing that's difficult about the cloud for most organizations is they kind of take a lift and shift approach to the cloud. And when you do that, you're missing out on not just the advantages, but you're kind of missing out on the fact that you could be potentially opening yourself up to a lot of risk because the security aspects of what was in your data center don't necessarily apply to the cloud in the same way. And one or two misconfigurations, whether it's a routing configuration or a access permission, spell disaster for a lot of organizations. So there's a lot of keeping watch and keeping an eye on what's happening for workstations or data that's being stored, not workloads or data that's being stored in the cloud. So a lot of observational data and telemetry that's really important. The other thing that is obvious, I think, is that with the diversity in locations and the workforce and the customers being kind of all over and disparate, you really lose visibility when you're trying to keep an eye on what is within the boundary and the scope of this audit. How do I scope and keep that kind of well defined and well understood so that we can answer these questions with an intelligent response about how a given set of capabilities or cybersecurity features apply to a given IA control. And then lastly, I think the havoc has also wreaked on the internal operations staff, and audits don't seem to be their favorite thing in the first place. So if you're in operations and you're busy running, vulnerability scans and you're working with, maintaining firewall rules or VPN tunnels, and you've got to make sure that people all have access. So you're buying new licenses for your VPN now that everybody's gone remote at the pandemic. The last thing you need is an auditor tapping you on the shoulder and asking for, evidence that some patch was applied or that you've run vulnerability scans. And it's happening every couple of weeks, based on the litany of different regulations that you're responsible for from an operations perspective, or it's happening at least, quarterly. And there's a lot of back and forth. Show me this. Okay, now show me this and show me this. So for organizations that are, again, doing this with spreadsheets, it's at some point, it just becomes obvious that this is not going to work out in your favor. And we're finding that, when we talk about finances, there's two really big numbers that I think we're going to touch on the second one. But the first one is organizations that, are not even heavily regulated are spending on average $3.5 million on activities related to, IT, security, compliance, and risk or privacy and risk management. That's a pretty big dollar sign for being able to evidence that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing from a cybersecurity and a privacy perspective. And for heavily regulated industries, we're talking about almost $5 million, annually. And again, that's not on the capabilities that are beating back the bad guys or finding and hunting them on your network. That's not the operational folks that are running the scans and doing the patching. This is just being able to manage and comply with the audit and the response to audit and collect the information and do it X number of times over the course of the year, have the staff to kind of deal with the auditors. So there's that piece, which is the cost of trying to stay compliant or maintain your compliance. And then if you flip the script on that and you go back and say, well, what are the costs of non-compliance? The fines are staggering. GDPR was a big wake-up call in most organizations that you can no longer just kind of buy everybody off with information, your personal monitoring, right? Like your credit monitoring. You're going to start being fined with numbers that have real teeth in organizations if we find that you're not respecting and not protecting people's privacy information in an adequate way. And we've seen some really big numbers get thrown out for fines in the course of the last couple of years as a result of GDPR. So it's also pushing pressure on these organizations, especially public ones. They don't want to have a compromise, and at the same time they realize that this compromise is coming not just with the impacts of their brand or reputation and whatever costs are associated with the cleanup and finding the issue of compromise, but it's also coming with the potential fines. And are we going to be found negligent? Was there a patch that should have been applied 6 months before and it wasn't? And as a result, bad guys got a bunch of people's data. So what's interesting is that out of the Advancing Foreign study, organizations have already been paying fines of about $500,000 over the course of the last 2 years, right? Again, these are averages. But if you take that and you start adding it to the fact that, we have a $3.5 million spend on compliance activities, which now I'm also paying fines of, around $500,000, and some of those, as the slide shows at the bottom, some of them, again, more heavily regulated. If you've got to comply with around 16 or more, you're paying up to $600,000 in fines. And that, again, that's in addition to the costs associated with running these compliance activities. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. These things shouldn't cost this much. And the reality is that compliance really should be a byproduct of good cybersecurity and good cyber hygiene and taking good care of people's privacy data. And the reality is that the cloud is a real promise to help us get out of a lot of our own way, from availability perspective. There's a little bit of concern with, configurations and confidentiality. I think that everybody's heard the story. For a while there was it seemed like almost monthly, there was a major cloud data bucket. I'm not going to say whose or what, but there was a major cloud storage area that would be accidentally inadvertently sent to public, and it happened over and over again. The data would be, anything from kind of rudimentary basics to trade secrets and or defense information or personnel information, privacy information. That was kind of happening on the monthly. And there's been a lot of updates to a lot of the cloud service providers have put in means and methods to kind of monitor those things. But it doesn't change the fact that, those things happen because it's usually one or two minor configuration changes that cause those spills, those data spills. So even withstanding that, the cloud really does provide for a tremendous amount of opportunity, with the ability to do different access control and the ability to kind of spin up and make things available and maintain availability, as opposed to kind of having an environment that could be a lot more systemically down if, certain major things like regions went down, power outages went down across a region, so on and so forth. So it does two things at one time. It does present us with a tremendous amount of opportunity, but when trying to discuss compliance or risk management with organizations or auditors that don't really have a good understanding of the cloud, it adds orders of magnitude complexity to trying to get through a regular audit or an audit associated with what you would say is traditional information security or cybersecurity activities and roles. And this is to say nothing if you're taking a more advanced look at how you're doing software factories and you're doing things like DevOps, and you're dealing with auditors and they're saying things like, well, what are you guys doing with the change control board? It's like, well, we don't have a change control board. We do DevOps. It's code is built within the last 8 hours and it's deployed through what's called a CI/CD pipeline. And so you're left in a lot of cases educating some of these auditors, and then it's sometimes a little bit of a fight to see if things should be applicable or shouldn't be applicable, and then again have that X number of times over the year because of 12, 13, or 16 different regulations that you have to be responsible for. I think most organizations believe that compliance will be an issue when you move to the cloud, and it will. And so trying to get out in front of that's really critical. One of the ways to get out in front of that is to really have an exceptionally well-trained staff on understanding cloud technologies. And it doesn't really matter which CSP you take and leverage, but because of the way that the virtualized cloud environment works, it's just different enough that it's confusing to most organizations but just above the real technical level. So you may have a lot of solutions architects, or you may have a lot of super technical people that can build and deploy workloads and get things together in almost a magical way, in the amount of time in the cloud that it would take, one fraction in the cloud of what it takes in a bare metal or even a hybrid environment. But it's the layer above them when you start to move up the levels, trying to articulate some of those things to again, risk officers, compliance officers, cybersecurity professionals that are more geared toward the audit and compliance aspects that are maybe a little less technical, right? Trying to really bridge those gaps is a challenge, and that's a big part of what comes. So you have to almost make sure you're devoting some of those technologists' time, some of those highly technical and skilled folks' time to being able to really articulate how the new technologies, especially these cloud technologies, play in the security and privacy world, and how relevant that is, and be able to kind of back it up with evidence. I think some of the best way to do that is with automation. We're going to touch on that in a second. So we talked a lot about audit fatigue and the different types and some of the costs associated, and a handful of the standards I think that everybody has seen, probably had some level of interactions with. One of the things I think it's really important to start talking about is what all these things end up doing to the staff and the organization itself. So we've already seen that costs have gone, up dramatically as far as, you've got different budgets, obviously, within most organizations for different things. You start to see the budget for, the risk and compliance activities. Again, this is just a team that is helping avoid fines, showing compliance with some of these core standards like SOC 2 or the NIST standards or HIPAA high-tech. This team, is constantly feeling not just undervalued because they're kind of looked at as, oh no, the auditors here, the compliance team's here, but they're also usually heavily overworked because of their lack of being able to find additional staff that are subject matter experts in some of these standards. That have some level of technical acumen and also some level of audit background, be able to understand the cybersecurity, especially in different technology environments, and then take and apply the evidence in such a way that the auditors really get a good understanding of it. So, as a result, that bears a brunt not just on that team, but it's a financial burden. And it's also a burden on the security operations team. As I mentioned before, you've got good security professionals that have spent a lot of their career doing really good vulnerability management or they're really exceptional at different aspects of cybersecurity, and they're kind of being tapped on the shoulder continuously. Can you give me a report that shows this? Can you give me a report that shows that? Can you evidence that we've done this patch, or that we're not vulnerable to this, or so on and so forth? And it just kind of takes a beating over time because they lose track of what they're supposed to be operationally focused on. At times as a result of the litany of response they need to be able to provide, especially for high op-tempo environments. And so we start to see this failure, these cracks kind of in the armor start to get bigger and bigger and bigger as more audits are happening, more standards are coming out, people are having to go learn and understand and interpret. And a lot of these standards, as most, I'm sure folks on the line here will know, they're not the easiest thing in the world to interpret, especially for your environment. I've helped to deploy a risk management product throughout the entire U.S. intelligence community, and they're all following the same standard. However, every one of them is doing it differently, and so that's just based on how they're organized, based on what their priorities are, and how they're dealing with risk and compliance. So that's also idiosyncratic of how almost everybody takes and follows a lot of these regimes, which adds to complexity and makes things, orders of magnitude more difficult. One of the things that came out of the Vance and Bourne study that I thought long and hard about was this percentage of professionals that personally dread their organizations being audited. There was a couple comments by risk officers and CISOs that they had like almost physical symptoms of dread and stomach aches, ulcers, all kinds of problems as a result of just the level of auditing that they have to comply with, and going into the boardroom, being able to articulate what's going on with certain audits. It takes a huge toll, again, not just on the organization and how the organization gets through with some of these audits, but it also takes a huge toll on these individuals. And when you've got the difficulty finding staff that most people have today in cybersecurity as a profession, and you hear all the advertisements on the radio for start your cybersecurity career here, and if anybody's out looking for staff, people who have been doing cybersecurity for a long time, and compliance activities, they're commanding top dollar, right? They're hard to find and hard to keep. And we're putting them kind of in a position as we continue to levy compliance regime and audit on their back. We're putting them kind of into a really difficult space. So I do think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think most people are getting to the point where they're going to be able to take advantage of that. I'll get to that in a second. One of the things I also want to talk about is one of the second order effects of all these audits and this audit fatigue problem. So, there's the cost associated with doing compliance activities. There's the cost associated with fines. There's a cost associated with finding new staff or having to, deal with staff leaving and trying to find replacements and recruiting and all those kind of things. The gap here that I think a lot of people miss is that what's happening while you're busy responding or evidencing that you're doing good cybersecurity. Like while your attention is kind of focused on audit and audit response and dealing with the people problems associated with all these compliance activities or new regimes and things, what's happening? So there's a handful of things that, in the Vance and Bourne study that they were saying, like, we could be doing so much more from a cybersecurity perspective. If I didn't have to stop and respond to these audits, I didn't have to worry about this so much or deal with the attrition that's happening as a result of, the burdens for risk and compliance activities, we could be doing a lot more data analysis, right? Or we could be doing a tremendous amount more innovation, or we could be doing, a lot more with researching these threats and being able to combat them before they become problematic. And I think that's a real true story. We talk a lot about security being reactionary, and everybody, kind of is stuck on their heels, if you're a cybersecurity professional. But a lot of it is because it's very valuable to be able to showcase that you're doing the right things from a cybersecurity perspective. However, it shouldn't be taking having to evidence that and spend time proving it shouldn't be taking away from those primary activities of kind of defending the castle and getting out in front of the problem instead of being reactionary. And so I think there's a handful of things I want to leave with everybody. We're going to take a bunch of questions. We already have a bunch inside of the Q&A box here. If you have any, feel free to put them in. I'm happy to try and share some responses and answers for you. But, for the most part, there is a way out of this hole, and it really starts with automation. And especially in the cloud, you really have an opportunity with what you can reach in and grab from the cloud. And this includes other third-party products as well, and different ways to get different data. But we're to the point now where about 30 to 40% of any given compliance regime can be automated by technically testable needs. And that is a huge reduction. It doesn't seem like it, but 30% of your time automated is considerable. It takes a lot of burden off. And if you've got all those things going into something like a repository, a single source of truth, now you've got a place where your auditors go that doesn't impact security operations. The data is coming directly from the tools that the security operations teams or the other teams and elements are using. It's getting fed into this single source of truth. It's got a mapping engine that actually maps across multiple standards. And it's smart enough to do that in a way that, it's not a one-for-one mapping. It's sometimes a many-to-one, or fractions or elements of one control to fractions or elements of another control. It's able to kind of abstract that, and then able to, build these audit evidentiary documents kind of on the fly. And this is all capable today. This is happening today in certain organizations, and it's really great to see. It's also really important to focus on maturity and not compliance. We see a lot of organizations that have trouble jumping the gap between a checklist mentality and doing this because, this actually enriches your organization's ability to do business. Like, cybersecurity is an enabler. It's not supposed to be something that's continually detracting from your time and effort and energy. And one thing we kind of we spend a lot harping on with organizations is find a common language, find a lexicon that works up and down the stack as far as your security operations folks all the way to your board. We highly advocate for the NIST cybersecurity framework. So it's at a high enough level, and it's derived entirely from much more rigorous regulatory standards like the risk management framework. And it takes into account a lot of other standards like the ISO standards. But what it gives you is this nomenclature that applies at the board level, at the CISO level or CIO level, all the way down to the security operations groups. And it gives you the ability to start looking at gaps inside of your organization. Again, maybe not at this very low level, like the actual audit for a given capability or set of systems or transactions, if you will. But it gives you the ability to start looking at, what maturity are we at, say, identity and access management, and where do we want to be, right? And where are investments? So we heavily usually in deploying our own products to kind of solve some of these problems or consulting to organizations, we heavily suggest starting to adopt a little bit of that so that it makes a lot of sense where you're spending your resources and energy on to bridge the gaps to get to the maturity that you need to for your cybersecurity and privacy programs. And so the other thing that comes about with automation is that if you're collecting all this information in a smart way and you're able to reuse it and purpose it, to show evidence without impacting a lot of other people across multiple teams within an organization or even a capability, you can start looking at remediation and orchestration. And this is really, when things start to get orders of magnitude better for everybody. If you've got the capabilities and it's all feeding this, there's two things that really come out of that. One is that you've prioritized what your high value concerns are, right? You kind of understand where are the high value assets or capabilities that are internal to your organization, whether it's a front facing website or a payment card transaction, whatever that set of systems is doing. And then you kind of can look at what threats and risks there are associated with that. So that's really powerful because you've got kind of this single pane of glass, this one source of truth. If you flip that around, it also gives you the ability to say, if you start to see something that's happening, like all of a sudden there's a misconfiguration on a bucket that shouldn't be public, just turn it back to private. All these things can really be automated now, and there's no reason why you can't take real advantage of that. Orchestration comes about additionally when you start incorporating it into other workflows that are slightly outside of or adjacent to your cybersecurity program. So you can start opening tickets or closing tickets or doing things with other groups and automation. And this is where you get a lot of value. I think one of the most interesting things that's really important that the automation lends itself to, especially in the cloud, but it doesn't unilaterally have to be a value of the cloud only, is understanding your asset inventory and maybe your software bill of materials. So with a lot of what's been happening in the course of the last few years, there's been a lot of people trying to bring attention to the fact that supply chain is a real concern. And I think this last 6 months has really proven that stance. But if you don't have a good understanding of where your software is coming from, right, and you don't have a good understanding of where your hardware is coming from or what assets are in your network and where you have access to, you're at a tremendous disadvantage to be able to take a step in the right direction of fixing some of these problems. And so again, that repository that's collecting asset information and also taking into account, who are your vendors, where is your software coming from, all these things. This is what a good centralized repository or a source of record or a source of truth really does for you. It starts to give you this visibility into all these different aspects of cybersecurity risk and compliance. And the automation comes in and starts keeping that data up to date for you, or running control validations on an ongoing basis so that you can keep a watchful eye on what's happening. The last two, I think, are probably the most important. First is being able to map across regulations. I kind of brought this up a few seconds ago, but it's really important to note that there's, we talk about all these different compliance regimes. We talk about all these different controls. There's really only so many ways to skin a cat. You can only test for passwords in so many ways. You can only show you made a control in so many ways. I'm not saying that there's one way, but there's only so many. So that if you got a given IA control, you can see that same request or that same kind of control exists across multiple regimes. Well, we advocate heavily to test at the highest bar. We usually think the NIST Risk Manager Framework or the 853, which has come out with a new Rev 5 catalog of IA controls, is kind of the high bar. But if you're international and you use the ISA standards, and if you're in HIPAA or healthcare, you use those, that's fine. But pick whatever that high bar is for you and your organization, and then do this mapping exercise. And there's tools there's tools that automate this mapping for you. We have something called predictive mapping that helps map across these regimes. So you can take and draw kind of a corollary and then reproduce evidence based on that. So you don't go in and test HIPAA and then 3 months later go in and test PCI and then 3 months later go in and test against these different regimes. And as silly kind of as that sounds, that's what a lot of organizations have to do, right? They're being audited on these different things at different times of the year, and they don't have a centralized response. They have a spreadsheet that kind of shows, how they've been compliant with things. So adaptive mapping or predictive mapping is really important because it gives you this ability to dramatically reduce the effort that those compliance folks and the security operations folks have to deal with. And then lastly, we've spent a lot of time on something called inheritance. And if you're not familiar with it, it's basically the ability to build a scope around a given capability. For instance, identity and access management is a really good one. So within an organization, kind of build a scope of your compliance and risk activities around, we call it a project, but a scope around this. And that capability then gets leveraged numerous times, throughout an organization. So if you have, for instance, an Active Directory, you've got a lot of systems that are leveraging that for access control, user identity management, so on and so forth, multi-factor authentication. You've now got an evaluated, tested, and audited system that you're keeping in this box that's able to now share controls with other systems that are taking and leveraging it. And inheritance is very robust when you do it right. You can have a one-to-many, many-to-one, or a shared and fully inherited set of responsibilities. And this really gives organizations orders of magnitude of value because you now can say, I've done this once. How can I take and reuse it time and time and time again for these other elements of other audits? And so with that, I think we're going to start getting into questions. And so I see a whole bunch of questions have been submitted, so bear with me as I go through here and read some of them. Let's start with, in your opinion, do regulations add value to the organization controls or not? So I don't think that it's a yes or no answer. I think that there are certain things that are really drawing a lot of attention to real concerns, that are happening inside of today's world. Privacy is certainly a good one. So when you start, this comes to me and really focuses on the privacy one lately because, I happen to live in Maryland, but our company is based in Virginia, and Virginia just passed a new privacy law. And a lot of conversation has been happening in the course of the last couple of weeks as to do you need every state to pass a new regulation? And I think there's a resounding no, right? You need a few early adopters to push the agenda, right? A few early legislators to push the agenda to really showcase that, hey, this, our privacy is something that we find important and valuable, and we want to be able to figure out how to hold people accountable, if they're processing our data, right? Our personally identifiable information. But there has to be a step at which you kind of take a step back and say, okay, we are now seeing a wave coming. We're seeing a wave where GDPR, from a European Union perspective, California Privacy Act, Virginia, and there's a handful of other legislation that's been passed or being passed in other places. For small mom and pop organizations, it's difficult to deal with, but also for larger, heavily regulated organizations, they now have to comply with potentially 50 or more, privacy standards. So I think that in some ways, having the validation that what you're doing from a cybersecurity perspective is going in the right direction, and maybe, compliance regimes or regulations help focus a little bit of, we should be doing a little bit more of this, maybe a little bit less of this, or, focusing on certain types of data, making sure it's tagged and secured. I think that's healthy, but it can become a runaway train really quickly. And I think that's what we're kind of on the verge of seeing with privacy. Everybody agrees that privacy is important. Do we need 50 different regulations, one per state? No, I don't think so. We got to start looking at how we do this a little bit better. So I think that's the best I can answer the question. It's a little bit of both. I think that it is valuable to the organizations, but it can be something that becomes very difficult very quickly. We had another good one. While automation can reduce audit effort needed, it does require upfront investment in time, resources, and funding. How do you see orgs overcoming that? Oh, that's a great question. So most of the time, you see organizations that are willing to take that time and energy embracing it because they've reached a breaking point. They've lost staff. They've come out of audits with tremendous fines. They kind of are at a point where they realize, I don't have a lot of other ways out. I have to throw time and energy in this to get past this. And to be almost a little bit frank, it's because they've played this security checkbox game for a long time, thinking that they can continue to just kind of nod their head and say, yes, we do this, yes, we do this, yes, we do this. And then when real hardcore audits come in, they find out that, you're really not doing this with the intent of the eye control. You're really not doing this the right way. It's kind of, you're really just doing what the control says. You're not meeting the intent of the control. And that's a very difficult place to be. So I think organizations realize once they kind of get to that breaking point, I don't honestly see a lot of proactive organizations. It's usually in response to either a breach or some sort of fines, and it's a shame because, again, it's reactionary. A lot of time and energy doesn't go into cybersecurity compliance before a reactionary, before something happens and it tends to be reactionary. But the good news is these organizations usually learn the first time. They have some sort of event, they have some sort of fine or some sort of problem, and then they realize, okay, we've really got to adopt a regime that makes sense for us. They do a lot of configuring and customizing it to their industry and their understanding of how to best walk through it. and they take the investment seriously. They kind of hire good staff, or they consult to the right folks, get a good tool, and they usually become successful with that. The reality is, and this is something we say to folks all the time that are starting their journey down, kind of growing a real capability in risk management and compliance internally at their organizations, that this is not something that you spend 6 months on and then you're done with. This is going to be a living, breathing thing that evolves over time. But the good news is it's going to continually pay dividends. It's going to pay dividends on the lack of fines that you're going to end up having to deal with. It's going to pay dividends on the fact that we're automating more and more. And it reduces not just the burden, again, on your organization and this feeling of dread, but also on your staff, right? So they see, I think, a lot of value. Let me grab another one. Is there a silver bullet that can just fix all of this? No. It's a combination of, as always, I think we've probably been championing this as security professionals for years. It's people, process, and technology. There is no silver bullet. There are some great products out there that that do a lot of this work. I've worked for Telos, and we've been building a product called ISACA for almost 20 years, and actually more than 20 years now, which is the database of record throughout a lot of the organizations I mentioned before. And it's geared at trying to do a lot of this automation and take a lot of this burden. But there's a lot of tools out there. I can promise the solution is not spreadsheets, and it's definitely not nothing is a panacea. Are we seeing a specific industry that seems to be more sensitive to or affected by these issues? I would say healthcare is starting to get this pretty badly. It used to be financial services. We used to see a lot of work in financial services. And they were having a lot of issues. They were spending a lot of money on audits, and they were seeing a lot of issues with audit fatigue. I think what we're seeing now is a dramatic rise in, because of the pandemic, the healthcare system that's dealing with a lot of crypto locker type things that are happening, and ransomware. They're starting to see that the previous way of kind of doing things is not working anymore. They've got to take a much heavier stance on compliance, and not just compliance, but good risk management in their cybersecurity operations side. So I think that they seem to me right now to be folks that are dealing with a much heavier burden and a much harder time with this than I had seen in the past. What do I see occurring in the future when it comes to mandated regulatory compliance? Well, I think that's pretty clear, to be honest. I mean, we're seeing more and more organizations or more industries, being, forced to deal with certain types of regulatory compliance or cybersecurity, guidance, things like that. I think that we're going to see a lot more of it. It's going to be a pendulum swing. We're going to see a lot of that move in a direction where you're going to see more and more and more. And then we're going to see breaking points, and then we're going to see lobbying, a lot of things that are trying to pull some of those, or consolidate. And I think that's where we'll start to see some real value, is when we start seeing consolidation. Everybody just takes a step back and says, like I said, at Telos, we're huge fans of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the work that they've done in the risk management framework, especially in the cybersecurity framework, the privacy framework, in addition to the consolidated catalog of IA controls, which is the 853. We almost unilaterally tell folks that we work with, these other standards are great, and we absolutely respect that you have to comply with them. But this one is really easily understandable and manageable internally, and you can take and map it across any of these other standards. And when you have that, you have a differentiator. And so I think that consolidation of those requirements and regulations is going to be huge. I think we'll see that in privacy. I think we'll see that in cybersecurity. I don't think we'll have to have the litany in the future, but I don't think that's coming anytime soon. That pendulum swing is going to take a little while. You're probably at least 10 years away. after the results of the study were revealed, what data point was most surprising to you? That's a good question. I think the personal dread. I've worked with a lot of organizations over time, and a lot of folks always took their role seriously. They really did. A lot of the folks that I worked with specifically were in the U.S. federal government, right? So they really had a core tenet and belief system in doing what they could to maintain the security or the privacy of the systems that they were charged with. I spent a lot of time with folks that were called authorizing officials. So these are the people that made the decision on whether or not certain systems would actually be used and process real data or be fielded to go places and do things. And so I kind of always understood that there was, stress that bothered folks. But when we got the numbers back from the audit fatigue survey, the kind of amount of money spent in compliance, minorly surprised me. The amount of fines, was a little bit surprising. But really, the idea of a group of people that I'm very close and intimate with having these kind of personal feelings of stress and dread, that were literally keeping them up at night and making them feel sick, really surprised me. And it started weighing on me that, we're not doing these cybersecurity professionals that we've all come to value so much. We're not doing them any favors by continuing to let these things operate this way. We've got to start turning toward technology as an answer, automation as an answer. There's no reason why these individuals should be feeling this way about their audits. Like, they should have a system that's keeping this data up and relevant and meaningful, right, from an evidence perspective for all of this great cybersecurity operations work and privacy work that's going on in an organization. And when you have that, when the auditor steps in, that organization should tell the cybersecurity professional to be able to say, auditor, just go ahead and take a look at this, print out whatever document you need. It's all right there. And I'll be happy to interpret it for you or answer questions. But it shouldn't have to be a hair on fire chase running around trying to find the right people to answer the right questions so that you don't fail an auditor how to find it. Like, I think we're all better than that at this point. So with that, I'm being told my time is up. Probably went a few minutes over. I apologize.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve. And there were so many great questions. If you didn't get your question answered during this session, please feel free to reach out to Steve and Telos. Telos has a booth at this event, so stop by, ask them any questions. They'll be happy to answer. And with that, thank you all for joining us for today's session. Please complete the session survey using the pink clipboard icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.